Welcome, everybody, and to Common Ground for Climate Action, sponsored by the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition and with some financial support from CROWS, the Community Resilience Organizations. And I'm Grace Gershuni. I know many of you here. I live in Barnet. And I've been very excited to be able to work with my co-presenters today, Kat Buxton and Dee Dee Purshouse. And we are going to just give you a little bit of information, update on what we know about healthy soils and their relation to climate change and a lot of other things, water and cooling the planet. And then we're going to listen to what you have to say. Before we get started, I would like to invite folks who are sort of out in the back to move up into the circle so that we can be talking to each other and not staring at empty seats. Come on, guys, we want you to engage the conversation along with us. We're not here to lecture you. Okay, and thank you for Kingdom Access TV is recording this, so we will have it available afterwards. So I think that's all the housekeeping sort of things. Oh, where are the restrooms? Do we know?
They're downstairs to the left.
Thank you.
Going to the left. There's one back through the kitchen.
One back through the kitchen and downstairs to the left. You can tell I'm not a regular UU churchgoer. So we're going to start out by going around. Please, people, come on closer. This is, we really, yeah, okay. So we're gonna have our presentations and our discussion about the information, and then we're gonna have a break, and we have lots of wonderful food to share. At 3, we have refreshments over here, coffee and tea, and as much organic and local as possible. And so we want to start out by going around and finding out who's here. And I will start out. I've already introduced myself. I'm Grace Gershuni. I've written a lot about soil and compost over the years. I am a passionate advocate for organic agriculture as a means of doing all the things that we think should be done. I've written some books. And I will pass the baton over to Kat.
My name is Kat Buxton. I'm from Sharon, Vermont. I'm one of the co-founders of the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. And I am a soil health educator, compost educator. I wear a lot of hats, all to do with the food system. And I wonder, in addition to introducing ourselves, we could also say what brought us here and what is your relationship to soil? And there are no right or wrong answers for either one of those. So I'll start. What brought me here was that I helped organize this event, and I'm very interested in public forums and public discussion and community building. I like to think of our work as building the social mycelium that helps hold our communities together. And my relationship to soil is ever deepening.
I'm Francis Carlett. I live in Peacham. My wife and I do a fair amount of gardening and small-scale farming. We have managed the community garden here in St. Johnsbury and Back Center Road over the last couple of years. Soil is key to having healthy and productive plants, and we're here to learn more about how we can improve the soils that we're growing plants on.
I'm Janet St. Ange. Yes, I've been gardening, dealing with soil my whole life, from Maine to Vermont. And I never tire of learning something new.
I'm Molly. I originally am from New York, but was in St. Johnsbury. My relationship to soil and
Yeah, what brought you here and your relationship to soil?
my mom brought me here, to be honest.
Or you guys' mom?
Not gonna lie. And my connection to soil is, I believe that ecosystems are really important. In climate change, I believe it's real. And I believe that it's going to be a group process to fix it. And I don't think that without public conversation and acceptance of the fact that it's a really huge problem and it's not just ourselves, it's a global issue, and if once we accept it, we'll be able to do what we need to do to fix it. And knowledge is really important.
I'm Michelle Ruckman, and I'm the mom that brought her here. I never thought about soil particularly in terms of the whole climate change resilience thing, so just that in and of itself was what brought me here, to kind of understand that. I had my first garden when I went to Vermont, so I'm just interested in getting acquainted with what our possibilities are.
I'm Karen Blitman. I'm from Jericho. And what brought me here was I spent a lot of my career working in clean energy, clean transportation, and realizing that the work we're doing to reduce the emissions wasn't going to do it. And we need to find natural, biologic ways to capture and store the carbon, which you all know much more about. So I'm interested in learning how we can use our soils, forests, wetlands to bring us back into ecological balance.
I'm Judy Delos. I live in St. Johnsbury. I have a small garden, so I'm interested in how to make that good and whatever I can do to contribute to the bigger picture of soil health.
Nancy Riga. Oh,
That lady in the back there.
Hi there, I'm Beth Shambing, and what can I say? I started out playing in the dirt as a little kid, and I never stopped. And for me, it's how I feel really alive, is being out in nature. And so ever since I read The End of Nature in 1989, I've been moving along this path, and I'm just so grateful that I found Kat and Dee Dee and Grace with all their years and years of sharing, of learning and sharing. And I have grandchildren. That's the big reason I'm here.
I'm Nancy Riga. Part of me lives in Greensboro. That doesn't make sense, but I grew up in the dirt, and I am in love when I'm in the dirt. Soil is so important to me. I want everybody to know what is, not to be growing lawns, not to, to be lasagna gardening, to be, I just want to keep feeding the mycelium of the soil. And so I'm really glad to be here.
I'm Kathleen Manns. I have a garden in Danville. It's been feeding us well for many, many years. And I came because I wanted to know, A, how to keep that garden producing and how to be good to the soil, and B, I would like to learn more of the bigger picture about soil and the environment and and climate change, and how we can use soil to help change what we have right now.
I'm Marilyn McKevin from Danville, Vermont, and I've
think she said that really well. And I don't have to repeat it, I would try, but I have the same garden and the same desire to keep the soil going and to learn more about the connection, the significance of the soil and saving life on our planet. And I came here because Dee Dee's here and Grace is here. And now I get to meet.
I'm Annie McCleary from Woodbury. What I've been doing for the last number of years, I direct my own school, Wisdom of the Herbs School. I teach the local trees, shrubs, and herbs, mostly to adults, but I have a homeschool group now, which is pretty exciting, little kids. And we really embrace the whole idea of resilience and adaptations and what we need to do to live on the planet as it is now. And I have learned more about soil since joining the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition than I've managed to learn in the last 30 years, and I've been trying. So I'm here to learn more, and I'm a gardener. I love being in the garden. It's just heaven and home to me.
My name's Ruby Perry. I'm from Burlington and garden with my husband there in earnest. And we catch water, and we've been learning about soil in the past few years, starting with Kat, when we learned about composting seriously. Always it was a more passive activity, but now we're actively doing it in our community, both with our neighbors, including a daycare center that drop off their food scraps, and we make compost. But we also are leaders of a community garden, which we started a community garden composting operation there. And soil has become pretty important as the more that we learn and that we're more passionate about it. And I feel like climate change is rapidly making all of us on the front lines. And I think that our gardens, the soil is where we will learn the most. So I'm really glad to be here.
I'm Andy Simon. I am also from Burlington, and all of the things that Ruby said, plus I don't know how, I got an invitation to the VHSC mailing list, and at first I went, oh no, way too many emails. But as it went on, I started reading them all, and it's fascinating. And my main motivation for coming here, besides learning, was just to meet people who are on the list. And I would say, the only thing I would add to Ruby's characterization was, as I consider myself a climate activist, and I know that we're in a climate emergency, and I know that the soil is going to contribute to alleviating that much more than anything else. So I want to learn more about that.
I'm Elizabeth Cotrera. A fellow AmeriCorps member told me about this event, so I'm here. And the more I learn about soil, the more excited I get. I grew up in a family of gardeners, but no one really paid that much attention to the soil. And also have a little bit of a background in climate stuff, more on the political side, but professionally and personally, I'm looking to do some more soil-based activism. Where do you live? Middlebury.
So I'm here representing New Hampshire. I did go to college right near here. It was frightening a long time ago at Sterling, and I started my direction towards agriculture, and I'm currently working in permaculture, working for families in transition in Manchester, New Hampshire. This summer we set up a community garden and production space on permaculture design to support food production for the soup kitchen down there. I'm also working to infiltrate Shaker Village in Canterbury with permaculture care for all the flower beds, and I'm a coordinator for New Hampshire Permaculture Day this year, which is at Shaker Village. And wanting to step up and be aware of policy as it regards soil instead of just changing minds here and there. What's your name? Lori. My name is Jael. I'm on the steering committee for the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, and I'm a farmer, organic vegetable farmer in Worcester. And I'm also the field organizer for 350 Vermont's Solutions campaign, and I've helped pass 35 solution resolutions throughout Vermont, and we want to try and pass another 35. And we added a point about building the soil carbon fund to the resolution this time around. So if anyone wants to get that passed in their town, come see me later. But I love soil. I love being in the soil, and for me, it rejuvenates me. It just gives me. It helps calm me. It's a warm bath, I guess. I'm Janet Hartson. I live in Barnett, Vermont. I was born a nature girl, and I'm an earth steward. And I feel like resilience is a really important piece for us, our communities, to be resilient. I think we have to work with our soil and love our earth.
I'm Dee Dee Pershouse, and I'm part of the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition and also the Soil Carbon Coalition. And I live in Thetford Center, Vermont, where I've been since the early 90s. I wrote a book called The Ecology of Care. That kind of writing that got me into this, and then have written a facilitator's manual called Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. It's a free download, and there's a copy of it back there. I'm here because I'm speaking, and I'm really excited about the energy that the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition has, what is that word, coalesced. I'm on a lot of different email listservs, and it's one of the most interesting ones to read and most engaged group of people who are contributing to it. So yeah, fun to come here and meet some of those people as well.
You've met me, let's go to Sarah.
I'm Sarah. I live in Barnett also. I'm here because I garden, and I don't really know what I'm doing most of the time. I don't even remember what I planted most of the time until it comes up. And that's kind of how I like it, but I did want to learn more, especially around the whole climate issue and soil. And I understand that soil is really important, and I want to see if there's anything that I can do on my own little way.
Hi, I'm Maria. I live in St. Johnsbury now, but I was born and raised in Rutland, Vermont. And in the early 70s, I came to Glover, Vermont, where I joined an intentional community. Of course, after a few years, we realized we didn't all have the same intentions. But my father always had a garden, and we had gardens at the common, and I always have gardens wherever I go. So I'm part of 2 different community gardens here in St. Johnsbury. And a lot of people have said it before me, but winter's an interesting time because in a way we're separate from the earth, but going out snowshoeing and cross-country skiing, at least you're out there with the trees, and you know it's down under there. And I bring a lot of my plants in, a lot of my herb plants, and it's always a challenge to keep them going during the winter. And I'm here because Beth told me about it, and I kind of helped her put up posters, and she's been talking to me a lot about it. We've gardened together, so. And I want to tell an interesting story. A couple years ago, I was having trouble with the leaf miners in my chard, and I had a lot of catnip growing near them. And one day I noticed there was a lot of spider webs, and I saw this big green spider. And what was there in his web but the moths that laid the leaf miners? And those chards right near there didn't have as many leaf miners in them. So sometimes we have allies out there we don't even know about. So I always, if I see that green spider, I always get it going right near the chard.
My name is Don Smith. I live in St. Johnsbury. I grew up with a family gardeners. We raise a lot of our food. And whenever I've had a place, which has been several, I have always had a garden. I spent some years in Mexico at a permaculture community, which really wasn't, but they called themselves that. But it was interesting being able to garden year-round. And we really actually got tired of it. We went and moved back at a different time. But I've been interested in soils ever since I read Wendell Berry's book, probably back in the 70s, about the decline of American agriculture. And I need to learn more about what the soils can do for the carbon.
My name is Jim Ortel. I live here in St. Jay since '03, and I've been growing vegetables for our own personal consumption in the little house in town here, and discovering what works and what doesn't work as well. 2 years ago, I started producing my own char, vegetable version, and this year I plan on generating some phosphorus from animal char, which I will try to produce the same way. So one advantage of producing your own char is you eliminate a waste stream that the good state of Vermont is now going to charge us for. If we send our vegetables and cuttings from the garden out off of our land, we're supposed to be charged for that now. So it turns out you can generate char from that wonderfully well. So I'm here to learn about how the addition of char will help the garden. I've only been doing it for 2 years, and I can't honestly tell you the difference. Of course, I say there's a difference, but I really can't tell. And you don't learn anything unless you can really tell what's going on.
I'm Madeline Winfield, and I live in St. Jay, and I have become part of the community garden at Duranus also in Beth. And before that, I lived in West Charleston, Vermont for many years, and we had a big garden. I would say that I'm sort of, I don't know, I do a lot of gardening, but I'm not a dedicated gardener. I love to garden, I love to be in the garden, I love the results, but I'm really excited right now to learn really more about how the soil is so integral to the whole picture. And I have a very different feeling about walking on the earth these days. And I'm just so glad that we're having this. And it feels like a very positive, great opportunity for all of us to be united in discovering again and again the systems that make life really work.
Well, I'm Bobby Corliss, and I'm a resident of St. Johnsbury. And I'm not a gardener or that, but I'm very interested in anything progressive. It has to do with how we eat and how we grow and how we preserve the planet. And I'm just kind of glad to be here because this kind of puts the frost on my weekend, because I just spent 2 days at the Vermont Humanities Conference, which was phenomenal. And so, like, this is just another end of it.
I'm Louise. I'm here with my dad. I'm sure some of you know my grandmother, Madge, Austin. I'm here because we just bought a new farm in Marshfield, and I'm going to be helping out there when we start farming. And yeah, I'm just very grateful what I have to say.
I'm Henry. I came with Louise. I'm glad to be here. Thanks so much, Grace, for inviting us. I was a teenager in St. Jay for a few terrible years, not so very long ago, I guess. I'm really interested in food justice and the scary places agriculture might go and the amazing places we might help it go. We just got a farm that has 50 acres of tillable land on it, and we're looking for farmers to come help us out and do what they want to do, especially trying to help demonstrate how to create a soil carbon sponge in a way that maintains viable farms. I think that's kind of proving out really well, and we'd love to work with farmers doing that. We started a farmer-led food justice organization in a few states a few years ago, and made some really great relationships with urban food justice workers and organizations who are still interested in working with us up here. And I think that I'd really love to help ground a more sort of rhetorical engagement in food and the politics of that with some successful production and some good cooperative structures to help scale that up. So those are the kinds of things that we're interested in, and we're especially interested in hosting farmers. We actually are asking for farmers to come and use our land for 1 to 3 years for free in exchange for doing cooperative projects with us. So your nose is better. Thanks.
Anybody else who hasn't spoken? You've heard from everyone?
Well, I'll just introduce Dee Dee then, and we can get on with the show. Dee Dee's already introduced herself, but I'm really thrilled that she came all the way up here to St. J and is going to really blow your mind. I think, there was one other thing I wanted to highlight is that anybody can be on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition listserv. It's about the key membership avenue right now, and it's very easy to join and very easy to partake as you wish in the fantastic discussions that we've been having. And we also have some bags there for donations, one for the church to give the church some money for use of the space, and one to help support the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. We appreciate any help you can give us. Thanks. Dee Dee.
And if you didn't sign in, please, when we have a break, will you give your name and contact information on the clipboard that's back there by the entrance.
And about that clipboard and sign in, there are checklists, so which maybe you want to wait till the end, but Kat and Grace and I and the Soil Carbon Coalition and Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, there are different mailing lists for those. So you can check to be on all of them or some of them or none of them or whatever you like. So. Okay, so I wanted to start with a little systems overview of what we're talking about.
Bring that up closer to your mouth.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. I think we're good. I think we're good. Can people hear me? There we go. Okay. So first of all, let's see. When did I get into this? In 2011, I didn't really know anything at all about soils before Hurricane Irene hit. And then I started noticing that soils move when water moves. I mean, I knew that as a kid. I spent all my weekends and summers in the country, grew up in the city, but played a lot in streams and things, but had never really seen it on a grand scale. And from Irene onwards, I got more and more interested in soils. And in 2014, I think it was, I made a decision to change my career from being a small town acupuncturist to working full-time in the world of soil health or soil carbon, or what I sometimes call the intersection of soil health and public health. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I say that because I want you all to know that you could make that decision today. And what happened for me is that by putting my energy there and getting the support I needed to keep going there from many of the people in this room, 4 or 5 years later, I was invited to speak at World Soil Day at the UN. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that to tell you that this is a very manageable thing. This is such a cutting edge subject. It doesn't take a lot to know a lot. Okay, so by the end of today, you will know more than most of the people that you know about this subject. So you will be an expert. I will dub you, okay? Which means it's then your responsibility, if you so choose, to take it forth and go and start talking to other people. And one of my goals, always when I'm speaking, is to give you some really simple ways to explain this to other people so that you can just walk out the door and start talking about it. When I got interested in soils, I didn't remember what photosynthesis was. I didn't know anything about soil science. I killed all my houseplants every year. My garden is a tiny little plot that is very shameful in the community garden. But it's possible to know systems on a large scale and to impact them in whatever skill set you have. So go forth. I'm giving my closing at the beginning, just in case I don't say it at the end. So let's just talk for a minute about photosynthesis, which is plants, and you can see there's a lot more of it happening on the left side of this landscape than on the right. And the left side is a restored landscape just to show what's possible. That photosynthesis is basically plants taking atmospheric CO2, the same stuff that we worry about there being too much in the atmosphere, taking that, taking water up from the soil sponge or the soil carbon sponge, and combining it and turning it into themselves. Okay? And then in that process, they give out the oxygen that we need to breathe. And they do this in the ocean, and they do this on land. So we get the oxygen that we need to breathe, and they also transpire or sweat, basically, some of that water back out, which keeps our climate cool. It's actually very cooling to have transpiring plants, not just the shade, but also those latent heat fluxes. So if you were to stand on the left side of this landscape, just kind of imagine being there barefoot, that it might be a little cooler on the left than it is on the right for a variety of reasons, including that transpiration that's happening. Okay, so they turn it into themselves, and then they also basically turn that atmospheric carbon into every living thing that you've ever heard of, above ground and below ground. And whether you eat meat or not, animals are part of the landscape and part of a healthy landscape. You don't have to eat them. You can just work with them. So the carbon in this picture is in the air as atmospheric CO2. It's in the plants. It's in the cow. And it's in all of the life that's in the soil. So some of that carbon, about 40%, people give different percentages, but a good chunk of that carbon that they take out of the atmosphere, they don't turn into themselves, the plants. They feed it out through their root systems underground to soil organisms. And those organisms feed other organisms, worms, and, voles and foxes, and a lot of different things. And then some of that life that's been fed by plants takes organic matter, takes other living things, and reorganizes it to change the flow of water through the landscape so that more plants can grow. So that happens on the level that we know of in Vermont. We're so lucky to have beavers here. But it also happens under the soil.
So it happens under the soil and they build a structure like a sponge. So this is my river watershed, the Pompanousek River watershed. Beautiful river, nice, relatively clean river. And there's what happened during Irene. I think a lot of us experienced things like this during Irene. And notice here that in these pictures, where the soil or the asphalt washed away is where the plants aren't growing. So this is the sort of first hint of the soil carbon sponge. This was that storm last July, July 1st, and this is a dirt road right behind my house, and a little tiny stream took out all of that material. But again, notice that where there were plants growing, it didn't happen. And then this is Lake Champlain. So the soil sponge, it's not just about holding soil in place, it's also about filtering what goes through. And I'm going to do a little exercise to show that. Then again, this is one to take back, take to your dinner parties, take to your classrooms, wherever you are. And we're going to just do a little demo to see what am I talking about when I say the soil carbon sponge. I'm just going to grab my props over here.
So is anybody here, this is a serious question, definitely allergic to gluten in the air? No, okay. Okay. I always like to ask that because there are some people who on the table, or do you want music speaking? I think I'm just going to put this on the floor over here. Okay, good. One kind of on either side. And Chris, if you can't see, why don't we put one here? Someone can do that, and I'll hold one over here. Somebody to hold it for you? Sure. So basically, I've just put some white flour onto a plate. I'm thinking about the camera being able to see, so maybe bring it up closer. I don't know. White flour on a plate, and we're using that as a stand-in for sand, silt, and clay, which is the broken down rocks part of soil. That people talk about soil as, well, how much sand, how much silt, how much clay. But sand, silt, and clay on their own are not soil. They need to be in contact with plant roots and with life in order to become soil. But if we don't treat soil right, and if it's not healthy, it will revert back to just sand, silt, and clay. And that's what, when we have a dirt road, that's sand, silt, and clay. It's usually mostly sand, but other stuff. Or if we have a bare field that has no cover crop on it, right? Or we have a landscape like that first picture that has reverted back to a desert that used to be a grassland and hasn't been regenerated yet. So let's see what happens if we rain on this. But first we need someone to make a rain cloud. So turn that cup over and put some holes in it. Okay. Is it working?
You have a great cloud technique.
Oh my goodness. Okay, who wants to be God? Everybody on this side of the room want to be God? Oh, great, okay. And who wants to be the goddess? The goddess on this side, okay?
Don't say that to anybody else.
Okay, so the god and goddess are going to pour rain into the rain cloud and rain on that landscape, but don't put too much on because this is a degraded landscape, and when it rains too much on it, some interesting things will happen. Do you want us to come closer?
Okay, so keep going a little bit. What do you see happening? You can put it about in half or maybe almost the whole top. What's happening?
Running off.
It's running off, yep. If this was a real landscape, what would be happening? What would we call this? Erosion, yeah. Yep, and a large scale, it's a mudslide. What's happening around the edges?
Flooding.
Flood, yep. And is that water clear? No, it's not clear. It's so we have runoff, right? So we have eroded soil, and that's silting up the waterways, but they're also, if you were using any chemicals, or if there was a lot of manure on the landscape, now suddenly we have all of that in our lakes and ponds and rivers, and we have that toxic algae blooms like we have in Lake Champlain.
That's what flows to the lowest point, so like a lake or the ocean.
Yes, right. So and there's an amazing slide, I don't know if Pat has it, of after Irene, what happened. You have that slide? Great, yeah. So we'll see what happens downstream there. So the other thing though is that we just had a lot of rain, and underneath here, has anything gotten down to the plant roots? No. So we have a flood and we have a drought happening at the same time. Flooding and drought are two sides of the same issue. It means that water is moving sideways instead of down. If you put that plate out into the sun, like in New Mexico or Africa or somewhere where it's really going to bake, what happens to the soil surface where it hardens, it turns into a crust. So then the next time it rains, even less water will go in.
That's how we get matzah.
What's that?
That's how we get matzah.
Yeah. Okay, so what do we need to add to the flour to turn it into bread, other than liquid? Only one ingredient is needed to make bread out of flour, other than water. Yeast, which is a microorganism. It's not exactly the same. Yeah, well, this is what would be healthy. You get it's darkening in color because there's more organic matter. Okay, so we've added some life, and by adding that life, it's a little different the way it happens in soil. But by adding that life, we've changed the structure of it, and we've also changed the function of it. So those little particles have been stuck together by the slimes and glues of life, if we're talking about a soil system, and then life like plant roots and fungi and nematodes and worms, etc., have moved through there to open up passageways, and suddenly we have a sponge that not only accepts water, but it also stays together when water comes through, because it's both water resistant and water absorbent at the same time. It's a beautiful thing. If your kitchen sponge fell apart every time you used it, it wouldn't be a sponge, right? It would just be mush. So let's see what happens. We still have some more. Let's see what happens when we rain on the soil carbon sponge. And here, we can actually rain quite a bit more. So you might need more water.
I don't know.
What's happening? What's different?
It's
absorbing it, okay?
Soaking it.
Is there any flood happening?
No.
Is there a landslide happening?
No. Need more water.
Okay. We can take another couple inches of rain. So, Irene, how many inches did we have? 7, 8, 9 different places, right? Some landscapes can take 9 inches of rain fine. Others can't take a half an inch of rain.
No, it's starting to.
Okay. So
seep out underneath.
Instead of coming off the top now, it's coming out from the bottom. And is it clean or is it dirty? Nice clean water. So this is a physical filter and a biological filter. It's cleaning it just because it's a nice carbon filter.
Nice.
Because that carbon is all of that life, and it's also a biological filter because all of that life in there is taking those carbon chains, petroleum, etc., breaking them back down into their original pieces. All right. So
That's an awesome demonstration.
And you are welcome to use that. I really hope that people will take that and use it.
So let's.
That with kids, you know, teach them bicycle stuff now, so they really got it.
Yeah. Yeah, I made that up when I was teaching at Mascoma High School for a week, and I couldn't, I needed to think of a way to just quickly get this concept across. So here's another great way, if you can get the NRCS soil health team to bring this to your, wherever you're giving a talk, or you can just use this slide. This is the real thing here, same idea, but the real thing. So on the far right is conventional cornfield. We're going across to using more and more of the soil health principles, which we'll get to. I don't know, Kat, are you going to talk about those? Okay. So, and on the left, we have all of the principles being used. So we have roots in the ground, we have perpetual green cover, perennial system, and no disturbance. So we're not putting that bread in a blender. And what happens? These are like big cookie cutters, so they're open on the bottom. And then the water's either, if anything runs off, it comes out to the front. So on the far right, we have no water infiltrating. 3 inches of rain on 3 inches of soil, or 4 inches of rain on 3 inches of soil. Nothing's gone through. All the water's run off, and it's taken a lot of the soil with it. So a typical cornfield in Iowa, to grow a pound of corn, you lose about a pound of soil. To grow a pound of soybeans, you lose 2 pounds of soil. Okay, not sustainable. And then it goes kind of gradually over, and on the far left, all the water is soaked in. It's clean by the time it comes down, and nothing has run off. This is a picture of the sponge up close, and you can see how that structure is being made with the little slimes and glues of life. Kat will talk about the soil health principles. This is a curriculum that's a curriculum that you can take a look at, take a snapshot of where the address is there. And I just wanted to show a couple things from schools. This is a water infiltration ring, simple thing that we can do anywhere to just time how long does it take for water to go down. So here we are in Chicago. This is here in Vermont. This is bulk density. So how dense is that soil? Is there that air space there? Okay, observation of the soil surface in a cornfield. Looking at the observation of looking at the soil surface with a bunch of kindergartners during summer school. Doing maps in Chicago to figure, so we can keep going back and observing the same spot in public parks and other places. Same thing in Vermont. And then we're back to that one. So, what's that? So that photo is in the Karoo region in southern Africa. And that on the left, the land has been being managed with holistic planned grazing using sheep. And on the right is also a grazing system using sheep, but just letting them go wherever they want to go. So we can talk more about that later. But that's the 2 books that are over there. And wanted to just, last thing, I've got a both online course going and happy to do in-person courses as well, where we kind of go deeper into this and build community at the same time. So, yes?
Your book has no price on it.
The books are $20 because everybody has a $20 bill in their pocket, I found. It just makes it easier. And if you don't have $20, then I'll take whatever makes sense for you. So, okay. Who's next? Kat. Thanks, everyone.
That's up next.
So yes, I am Kat Buxton, and I run a consulting education business where I wear a lot of hats called Grow More, Waste Less. So if you put the check under Kat Buxton, that's who you would get emails from. In 4 years, I've sent 2. I have aspirations for sending more, but No promises there. And, I started the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition with a group of other people because I went to a 3-day workshop in 2016 called The Soil Sponge that Dee Dee put together and invited Walter Jena, who is an Australian climate scientist and soil microbiologist. And after spending 3 days with him learning about the soil carbon sponge, and not at all learning what I thought I was gonna go there to learn, I went to learn which specific plants were gonna hold the most carbon and all these really specific questions, and realized that I was thinking way too narrowly and that I needed to broaden my scope and ask better questions. And Walter encouraged us all to be bold, and I really got for him that being kind is also critical. And so leaving that, I felt like, wow, I had all this deepened knowledge, and the only other people who knew this were the people that were in the room that day, and we needed to have a place that we could continue to talk about it. And so we started the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition as a place that we could simultaneously build the social connections that we needed while building the soil connections that we needed. And for me, that's turned into understanding the mycelium of the soil and the biological network underground, and also the social mycelium, which really does hold our communities together as much as the mycelium in the soil holds landscapes together. And we're learning a lot there. And it's despite all that we know and all these experts and all this, everything that we've done as humans in the world, we rely on this really thin layer of topsoil, and it's getting thinner and thinner. The picture on the right was taken in 2018 by a colleague of ours from the Soil Carbon Coalition, the co-founder Peter Donovan, as he was traveling through Iowa. And that is Iowa corn, and that is a river right there. And that's a pretty sheer wall, and you can almost see the soil moving away. And in the Midwest, there were places in the Midwest where we used to have 20 foot of topsoil that the buffalo had left us. And we've taken it away pretty quickly. And so that inspires me to want to do more. And as I begin to learn more about soil and policy, and how to work with people, I'm realizing that working on a series of principles is much greater and opens up a lot more possibility than working on principles of policy or regulation. Policy and regulation can be very confining and produce barriers that you didn't even intend to produce, whereas if we focus on principles, we're not confining ourselves. So these are 5 principles that were put together. Well, the top 4 were put together by the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service branch of the USDA, where they're doing some really amazing work. There are a team of scientists that are part of the NRCS that are really incredible. One I'd like to highlight in particular is Ray Archuleta. That's a name worth writing down. He's got amazing YouTube videos, and he is so passionate and enthusiastic about soil, he makes me look really quiet.
How do you spell that?
Archuleta. One T. Archuleta. And he's from New Mexico. So these are the 5 principles, and we're gonna kind of run through those really quickly. Living roots in the ground. Living roots with growing green plants in the ground for as long as possible everywhere. That's a principle to try and move toward. Maximizing diversity. Nature doesn't do monocultures anywhere, and the more diversity, the better we get of everything. Minimizing disturbance would be things like digging and tilling and chemicals, and notice that it says minimize and not eradicate. I think that's really important. No bare soil. The word no is pretty definite there. But again, I'd like to say dramatically minimize bare soil. There are some insects in this world that completely rely on bare soil. But nature has a way of making sure that bare soil is present without us creating so much more of it. And animals in contact with soil, so that's you and I, that's microbes and grasshoppers, that's giraffe and elephants, that's cows and deer, chickens and goats, everybody. I'm going to take us quickly through the very large circle of life, just in the context of carbon and water and sunshine. So because making those connections to these really simple yet really grand concepts, I think are what enable the possibilities in our thinking and open up what the barriers that we create for ourselves about what is possible. So we have photosynthesis, very basic system, but very complex also. And in a nutshell, photosynthesis is taking carbon dioxide out of the air, turning it into sugars that then plants feed through the root system. We like to think of these as cakes and cookies for the biological organisms that live under the ground. The sun has a budget. You know, there is only a certain amount of sunlight energy, and it's used in very different ways. And part of our trouble right now is that our sunlight energy is creating more heat that's not able to be absorbed by the earth and or shot out into space. And so we have bouncing heat, and that's warming our atmosphere, and it's warming our oceans and warming our landscapes. 20%, 25, and 5%, so about 50% is dealt with up in the air, and I'm going to focus on the 50% that hits the ground. And then anywhere from 30 to 40 and even 50%, some say, of that sunlight energy actually goes into the soil if there are green growing plants there. If there aren't green growing plants there, it reflects off of bare soil and actually creates more heat that we can feel with our feet, we can feel with our bodies, and we can also see in our warming oceans and warming globe. And all of this has to do with transpiration, which is when plants sweat, or animals or people, anything, putting water back up into the air. So in short, we have sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water going into leaves, these amazing machines called leaves, the first solar panels. We can learn a lot from them. We don't have to invent a machine, although there are people working on inventing machines that can actually photosynthesize better than plants, but yet we're not maximizing the potential of plants to do that for us. 40% of our agricultural land globally has either been desertified or severely degraded. So when we think about the possibility that that provides us in providing more green growing plants on those places to kickstart photosynthesis, it's pretty exciting to me because that's very doable. They've planted a lot of seeds. The picture on the bottom right is one that you can get in better detail on the Soil Carbon Coalition website. This was put together by Peter Donovan, and it's a draft run of sort of a snapshot of 3 years worth of photosynthesis in the Lake Champlain Basin. So that is Vermont. So we're looking at a photograph that was taken about every 16 days, and it's called the Normalized Differentiated Vegetation Index, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. It's an indicator of the work of photosynthesis. Landsat passes over with satellites every 16 days, and it can take pictures of these. And so Peter took 3 years of that and put it into one static photo. And all of those brown areas are places where we're not producing photosynthesis, and we could be. The dark green areas are more than likely largely coniferous forests, which are conducting photosynthesis 365 days a year. So that's one end of the possibility. And then the other end would be places like Burlington or some of the cities. So some of those brown spots are cities, but some of those brown spots are where we grow corn for cows. And if we were to pan up and actually look to our northern neighbors north of the lake, we would see a lot more brown. So I see that as, again, an indicator of what's possible. We know how to grow things. We know how to conduct photosynthesis. So sunlight comes down and into the plants, and it's turned into sugars inside the plants, and then follow those yellow arrows, and those yellow arrows are going down into a very complicated system where nutrient cycling and water cycling and carbon cycling are happening with billions and billions and billions and billions of life forms underneath the soil. Those are, Elaine Ingham is another person to check out if you want to learn more about what I'm going to talk about, which is the soil food web, and that's INGHAM. You can find a lot of free information online, but she also offers some courses, which I have taken. And she likes to talk about the sugars as being the cakes and cookies for all of these little critters that we're trying to attract. So those cakes and cookies head down through the root systems, and then all around each individual root hair is a place called the rhizosphere. It's this teeny tiny little place, sort of a force field surrounding every root hair. And these little white hairs that you see coming in off to the left and right are actually fungal hyphae. It could be mycorrhizal fungus, or it could be another kind of hyphal spreading mycelium fungus. The rhizosphere on the left side here, you're seeing all around that tree. So that's actually a limited vision of the potential of the rhizosphere. It could be much larger than that. And if you're to include mycorrhizal fungus, which goes this way, it goes every which way, and connects entire forests, that increases the vast possibility. Inside that little rhizosphere, which is the blue area around the root system, you see all these little red dots. And those are depicting billions of microorganisms around every single root hair. That area needs to have a balance of water and air. And so having it growing in a sponge is important. If we're growing plants in the flower or sand, silt, and clay, we're growing them in compacted areas where there are no place for water and air to actually get in and hold in the soil. But if we're growing plants in the bread or in soil, because the difference between dirt and soil is that dirt is sand, silt, and clay, soil is sand, silt, and clay, and life. It's biology, just like the yeast in the bread. Then we have places for air and water. Then we have places where plant roots can actually move quicker. They can produce more mass. And the more mass a plant root has, the more rhizosphere it has, which gives it the more possibility to have billions and billions and billions of organisms within that rhizosphere. That's where nutrient uptake takes place. So biology can take sand, silt, and clay and solubilize it into nutrients that are available to plants. And it does that by producing organic acids, which can actually dissolve sand, silt, and clay and make nutrients available to plants as long as they get into the rhizosphere. Bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, these are all some of the organisms that we're talking about, and mycorrhizal fungi as well, and all mycelium. And can be very vast. And so these are some of the organisms. And this is a soil food web, which was coined and discovered in this term in the 1990s. So it's a pretty new science. And the more that we're learning about soil microbiology, the more we're finding that it's changing the way we look at every single field of science. It's pretty amazing. Oceans, caves, soil, air, all of it. And we're finding that these minuscule biological workers are actually doing incredibly important work, like nutrient cycling. There's nobody walking around with bags of fertilizers in the old growth forest or in healthy grasslands or any healthy natural ecosystem, yet those plants are able and have been able to, for as long as plants have grown on the planet, get all of the nutrients they need. And the way that they're able to do that is through this interface of biological organisms. They're the great communicators. So I like to try and think of myself as a biological worker and how can I do that job better? If you were to take out any one piece of this web, it wouldn't work the same way. We need them all. So many of us have gardens that we till or we move the soil around a lot, we disturb them. And when we do that, we're creating conditions where it's very difficult for our secondary and tertiary soil organisms to thrive. Some might be able to survive, but we end up with a really highly bacterial environment. And bacteria are good. There are anaerobic and anaerobic. There are, thousands and thousands of species of bacteria, 75,000 that I'm told. I'm not aware of them because that's a whole big long list, but that's what I'm told. 75,000 species of bacteria. So they're really small, they reproduce really quickly, but they can't communicate directly with plants unless they're in the rhizosphere. But how do they get there? Part of the way that they get there is through working in relationship with the other critters in the soil, including mycorrhizal fungus, and being able to move around in liquid in that soil. So that's the water. And that's also the goos, snots, and slimes that are created by all of the organisms in the soil as they work, as they do their biological work. We need them all. Bacteria needs to be eaten and pooped out in the rhizosphere in order for its nutrients to become available to the plant. And bacteria doesn't eat bacteria. Bacteria needs to be eaten by something else, like a protozoa or a nematode or fungus. So this is another picture where I love the possibility that it's showing. This is root depth potential. This is obviously a drawn picture, and this is a cross-section of plants from the southwest prairies. Some of these, as the gardeners in the room might notice, lupin and echinacea and a few other things that we're familiar with in our gardens. But it's less important what these species are and more about the possibility of that root depth. I always like to point out that that's 15 feet. Would you ever have imagined that plant roots could go 15 feet deep? If there's a layer of compaction, which most of Vermont has, a pretty heavy-duty plow pan created by humans, those roots can have a hard time getting through there, but it's not impossible. There are some plants that are much better at that than others. I also like to point out the top left corner, inside the red circle, is your standard lawn grass. So when we think about the rhizosphere and all of the amazing activity and important cycling of nutrients and water and air and carbon, we want to increase the living roots in the ground, not just by number, but in depth and in quantity, so in the mass underneath each plant. And we can do that by building the soil carbon sponge. The far right is called buffalo grass. All the way to the right, buffalo grass. And I do have a copy of this floating around over here, so you're welcome to take a look if you really want to know those plant names. So all of these organisms together, along with living roots and the plants that grow up above the ground that are pulling in the photosynthesis, are holding our landscapes in place. It's literally the goos, glues, snots, and slimes that those organisms make that are holding the landscapes in place. But they can't do that without the living plant above and below to catalyze that soil building. Soil organic matter can hold 18 to 20 times its weight in water. When we think about the fact that all of the climate projections say that we in this region of the world are going to get more water, more and more and more water, that to me is a cue to deepen our in-soil reservoir, to deepen the places within our soils that can hold water. 1 inch, what is it? I think it's 1% increase of organic matter in the top 6 inches of soil per acre can hold over 20,000 gallons of water. Who here owns or maintains more than an acre of land? So that's the possibility there, just really excites me. Living soil can absorb and store greenhouse gases and retain and cycle water. And the third one in yellow is always, it blows my mind too. The first meter of soil globally contains 3 times as much carbon in soil organic matter as is found in either the atmosphere or in living plants. So again, the potential of soil is so, so great. And I just want to be clear that when we talk about carbon in soil, as Dee Dee said, that's the cow, that's the grass, that's the microbes, that's the roots, that's us. We are all made of carbon. All living beings are made of carbon. When we draw down sunlight and carbon dioxide, we turn it into life. We don't turn it into life. the other biological workers in our world doing the important work, turn that into life. And we slow that carbon cycle down. We're not stopping it. We shouldn't try to stop it. We need cycling. So we're just slowing it down. I mean, that's ultimately where dinosaur juice came from. Fossil fuels is a slowed down bit of the carbon cycle in the soil. And we're draining those reserves very quickly and putting them up, and we're not bringing anything down. This is Long Island Sound after Hurricane Irene. And I imagine that that's a lot of Vermont's dirt roads.
Yeah.
And I imagine that that's a lot of Vermont's backyards and riversides and farmlands, especially those that are tilled. And so many of our farmlands, of course, are in our river valleys, so it makes sense that they would come in direct contact with water quite a bit. And if we don't have the soil carbon sponge in place holding those landscapes together, water in its great powerfulness can more easily take all of that soil away and deposit it in our oceans, where we also have an incredible ocean dead zone problem, which is another whole issue. So can we slow our water down? Can we sink and capture water? Can we restore it back to our aquifers? Do you think the folks in California are wondering how to get the water back into the soil? Their aquifers are draining. All of our aquifers are draining. They're not recharging at the rate that they should be. And part of the reason for that is because we treat rainwater like a waste product. There is a guy named Michael Krauschik, who is a Slovakian hydrologist, and he is part of the new water paradigm, Voices of Water for Climate, if you want to learn more about him. And one of the great things I learned from him, very simple concept, is that we treat water like a waste product. It's a gift from the gods. It falls from the sky, and we say, get out of here as quickly as possible. Go down that impervious surface, down that drain, out to our oceans, take our soil, our chemicals, and everything else with you. But we don't ever say, at least in a community planning and zoning purposeful way, how do we get that rainwater back into our aquifers? If we can just simply catch and slow the water, water finds its way there. We don't have to tell water how to get there. We just have to give it the opportunity to get there. So this is just showing you runoff potential in a city. 98 to 100% of, if water falls on impervious surfaces, it's going to go down the drain. If it goes on good ground cover, most of it is going to go in. And there are lots of things that this depends on, but there is that extreme that we can be working with. And how can we move more toward the left side in every single landscape, whether it's your backyard or public lands or farms? How do we move more toward the good ground cover? On the top right, you're seeing not a super great image, but it's showing us where the greatest ocean dead zones in the world are. And those all correlate with our highest agriculturally productive lands, which are also the places where we're losing our topsoil the quickest. We can stop wasting water, stop creating ocean dead zones, and start figuring out innovative ways to catch and slow water. This picture on the bottom left is actually taken in the parking lot at the Davis Center at UVM. So those are some wonderful things that the youth in our world are trying to do to build in these concepts. Can we provide more ecosystem services? This is a term I would love to be a common term. What are ecosystem services? Ecosystem services are things like forest production, water flow regulation, water quality and regulation, preserving habitats and biodiversity, carbon sequestration, regional climate and air quality regulation, infectious disease mediation, pollination. We could go on. There are so many incredibly significant ecological services that we need, but we don't value them in a money way, which makes it so that we don't really pay attention, it seems. So in this picture, the words going around each one of those sort of flower-like symbols are those on the left-hand side. And on the very left one, we're looking at natural ecosystems. So natural ecosystems provide everything except for crop production. the way that humans envision it. And then humans come into play in the middle, and we say, well, we can fix that. We have crop production at the expense of all other ecosystem services. And now that's really catching up to us in so many ways. So can we move toward the right side where we complete all of the petals in that leaf flower? Can we grow enough food and restore natural ecosystems? Can we mimic natural functioning ecosystems to do this? This is happening all over. And when we look for the most innovative farm practices or land management practices, we really have to look no further than most of the indigenous people all around the world who have been practicing these practices for a long time and managing to do so without completely destroying their ecosystem. Not to say that there wasn't some damage along the way. And on the bottom, we're looking at beaver ponds. So can we learn to manage water from some of the greatest water managers on the planet? What can we learn from them? Can we shift our systems to provide multiple ecosystem services versus single ecosystem services? So on the left side, we have images, and these are actually mostly from Vermont. So we happen to live in a part of the world where we're incredibly lucky. We have lots of small farms producing a diverse amount of and plentiful amount of food, using animals and crops, variety. So we have permaculture and agriculture and silvopasture and all sorts of really innovative practices providing us with great food, yet we only produce, I think, less than 5% of the food that we eat.
4.6%.
4.6.
12.6. According to the latest farm to plate.
We're climbing, and that's really good, right? So that's helpful. And on the other side, we have the bulk of our food system leaves behind a place where the only ecosystem service being provided is that to provide food for humans. And if you follow that all the way through to what that does to our overall human health and our psychological health and public health globally and our microbiomes, you might think, well, actually, we're not providing any services at all. So can we move from that toward this? And every step that goes away from that and toward that is a good one.
What's the picture of the third one down on the right middle?
Third one down, right middle, this one.
Yeah.
That is a hog farm leach field after a rainstorm. So that's what it can look like after it rains really hard in hog country. And that's a really common scene, And most of those hog farms are located pretty directly above the Aguilala aquifer, is that how you say it? Which is also draining. So can we measure impacts and outcomes? Can we hire land managers to produce the outcomes we want? How do we create value for ecosystem services? I don't expect answers. These are just questions that I think are really important to ponder, and they inspire me to want to do better in the world. If right now, we know what our impacts, our losses, our liabilities are. Drought, flooding, erosion, infrastructure damage continually, to the point where we can't even rebuild from the last storm before the next one comes. Riverbank scouring, sedimentation, atmospheric carbon, way too much of it, nutrient runoff, nutrient leaching. Those are very real, but who's paying for that? And then on the right side, if we are to employ ecosystem services and change the way that we interface with the land, some of the outcomes and gains and assets could be plant available water, stream base flow, purity of water, quality of water, groundwater recharge, surface water temperature regulation, soil carbon sequestration, soil fertility, pollination, wildlife habitat. Are those things in the green things that we value? And do we value these things on the left-hand side? I mean, we're certainly impacted by them. So how do we shift our thinking between impacts and values? How do we do that, and how do we translate that into hiring our land managers to continue doing the great work that they're doing, rather than creating more and more barriers for them? What would it be like if farmers could be paid to deepen watersheds and increase pollination. Maybe they could get a fair price for the food that they're growing. Maybe they could hang on to their land and continue to steward it so well for us. So the soil health principles are something that we can all embody, and we can do this on our porches and rooftop gardens. We can do this in our backyards. We can do this on our farmscapes. We can do this in city parks, on highway medians. We can do this in our schoolyards. There isn't anywhere that we can't think about ways to employ the soil health principles and to further embody them into the way that we think and the way that we interface with the land that feeds us. And we're gonna segue now into Grace, who's gonna take us into what can we do about this? And this is a handout that I have over on the bench, just really simple bullet points of what can I do just to get you thinking about ways to get involved. And if you're the kind of person who's interested in policy and regulation, I would like to encourage you to undo the barriers. How can we undo barriers to deepening our watersheds and hiring our farmers and reducing our impact, living more simply? Gray water barriers are a great place to start. We have all sorts of barriers in place to make it so that we have to have lots of money to manage wastewater when we could be managing that in a more ecological way, but the law prevents us from doing that. So I'm not going to take too much more time about that, and I'm going to turn it right over to Grace. And Grace is...
Are you all or any of you going to share your slideshow?
Absolutely. I would, I will share my slideshow. And if you sign up on if you check Kat Buxton, I will send you the PDF, which is a Google Doc. Happy to do that. Get me up there. Yeah, where are you here? Soil carbon sponge. So which what do you?
On the
You're in Kingston.
11/2008.
Oh, okay, this one here. All right, and we're gonna get you to. How come you don't have presentation slide? Oh, there you go. There you go. All right, and then your arrow will get you where you need to go.
Okay, thanks, Kat. So I think we've been inundated with information, and really I'm going to try to just give us some clues about some of the other things that we can do. And we'll get to... Okay. Oh, thank you, Jim.
Good.
That's fine. Yeah. I just want to make sure I'm heard for the various people in the room who can't hear so well. So, Kat has done a lot of the work that I was looking at doing, but I want to give you a little bit of my favorite piece about climate change and how I answer those who say, well, I don't think that humans cause climate change and who cares? And you know, that's a discussion that a lot of people around here have, and that, you know, we have an answer for it. And as Kat made it clear, there are a lot of other things that healthy soil does for us, and that growing food and growing other kinds of plants in that way does for us. My whole adult life has been devoted to advocating for changing the food system to a healthy, balanced food system, and that only more recently have been realizing that doing that work is also going to help us avoid and mitigate the impacts of climate change.
And I have written some books as well, and they are back there available for sale, including The Soul of Soil, which is my classic that's still in print from Chelsea Green, and the Rodale Book of Composting just did the revised, updated edition of that, included a lot of the information that I've gotten from participating in the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. And the memoir is about the whole struggle over organic farming standards. And that's the next piece here. So the food system in general is a major contributor to the climate change that we're experiencing, to the greenhouse gases. This graphic comes from an organization called GRAIN, which does a lot of great work, particularly in the developing world or the global south, with politics and issues about land grabs and agribusiness. And they have looked at some of the data that's come out, and they're conflicting points of data. But I would point out that things like food waste, which a lot of people are paying a lot of attention to, that is given only about a small sliver of the responsibility for climate change. The transportation, so people worrying about food miles in terms of energy use are certainly correct in worrying about that, but it's also a relatively minor portion of the food system's contribution to climate change. And agricultural production is a little bit less than that, and I think by that they mean things like livestock production and so forth, and crop tillage and the actual machinery used to produce food. Land use change and deforestation is a major one as well, about equivalent to processing and transport. But then there's this big other non-food related emissions, and I couldn't really quite get my mind around what the heck they meant by that. That's a huge chunk of it. Well, I took a look at I listened to Paul Hawkins speak, and I got a copy of the book Drawdown, which I understand that 350 Vermont is going to be basing a lot of its work on. And what they did was that they drew on a huge amount of data, economic data as well as technical data, to try to identify the 100 best ways to draw carbon down out of the atmosphere and to try to reverse climate change. And they looked at it by different sectors and specific technologies. So the food sector is a major point of opportunity when it comes to drawing down carbon. And all of these ways of working with the land and avoiding harming the land rate a whole chapter, a whole segment in this book, which I highly recommend. I believe there's a copy in the Athenaeum. I'm not sure, but if there isn't, we should make sure that there is. So I'm not going to go into any detail on any of that, but look again at the agricultural production end, as well as the farm input end. And I think that huge slice of the food system energy pie that you saw earlier really is about the farm input end, the agrochemicals, and in particular, the use of nitrogen fertilizer. The heavy use of nitrogen fertilizer, which we all know is also a pollutant, The nitrogen is part of the cause of our surface water pollution, but it is also extremely energy intensive to produce. So I saw one statistic, and I don't know where it came from exactly and how it was measured, but there was an estimate that 3 to 5% of the world's supply of natural gas is used to produce synthetic nitrogen. That is the entire use of it. And not only is the production of nitrogen by essentially, heating up and using high amounts of fossil fuels in order to do what the microbes in the soil do for free. The nitrogen that's produced ends up, when there's too much nitrogen applied, it ends up going back up into the atmosphere, because nitrogen also is a cyclical nutrient and wants to be a gas. And before it becomes the very stable nitrogen molecule in the atmosphere, it becomes what's called nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide comes up off of the field when that fertilizer has been left on the surface. It runs off in the water in different forms. But the nitrous oxide is approximately 316 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. And that is another major contributor. So we also have, I have some arguments with some friends who happen to believe that cattle and livestock are the source of all evil in terms of climate change. And because of the fact that that as they ruminate and process their feed, they emit gas, methane gas, and we all do that when we fart as well. So what is the problem with that is that in those confined animal feeding situations that you saw pictures of in Kat's slides, cattle are bunched together. They are not allowed access to the soil, to the plants. As they are green and growing, they are given some forage in the form of hay, but most of their diet is grain. Grain that's grown on by tillage that destroys the soil, that costs the several bushels of topsoil per bushel of corn and soybeans that we saw earlier, and that is not their preferred diet, and that does produce more gas in their rumen, and that doesn't give the benefit to the soil. So it's a terrible system of livestock production. If you are going to eat meat, it should be meat that has been fed on pasture outdoors as much as possible, whether it's chickens who need to scratch in the soil and eat bugs, or whether it's ruminants who actually help improve the ability of the grasses to regenerate and reverse desertification. So I'm going to skip the yet another view of the soil health principles. Thank Kat for putting some of these slides together. And I don't think that it's too terrible to continually repeat what these are. These are not the principles of how it works. These are the principles of what we need to do to make it better and to protect it. And these are some examples of different scales. Most of you here are gardeners. If you're not gardeners, it's okay. You can certainly patronize people who are growing food this way. And thanks to the fact that there is a growing and healthy movement for organic agriculture, you can do that. And I'm not going to suggest that we should all become certified organic farmers, or that organic certification is the only way, but it is a major way that the public has become aware of the difference. And I like to suggest that even there have been many studies done at this point. Well, I don't know what you would mean by many, but at least half a dozen studies that show that organic agriculture outperforms conventional agriculture when it comes to the amount of carbon that is stored in the soil, whether you're talking about, the ultimate perfection of adherence to all those soil health principles, or just some of them. And it also does better when it comes to water quality protection. It also does better when it comes to biodiversity conservation, and there have been several studies on each of these measures that show this. There's a lot of people who are beginning to question the value of organic, and they are also questioning the, if I get non-GMO, isn't that just as good? It says natural, isn't it just as good? How many people here have felt that kind of confusion? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is a confusing landscape at this point. And there are certainly better farmers, and there are some farmers and there are some processors who go just the bare minimum just to get that green and white USDA seal. But even those, when you count them in with everybody else, do better. So I won't belabor that anymore, other than also to point out that the non-use of nitrate fertilizer, of synthetic nitrate fertilizer, is a huge step in the right direction. If all we could do was to make sure that we didn't manufacture and disperse nitrogen that's synthesized from natural gas over the landscape, we'd be going a huge distance in the right direction. And then Kat had some great slides showing some of the Vermont-based and out farther groups that are working on educating the public, advocating for policies that help work in this direction. And we're having more and more people who are doing serious research on the ground, not necessarily part of the academic research establishment, but there's all kinds of citizen science going on. Some of the slides that Kat showed and the work that Dee Dee has been doing with the Soil Carbon Coalition is a fantastic example of citizen science, where people are measuring the soil health on their own land and all over the country, and then sending that data to the Atlas Bioworks, is that what it's called, right? And having that data collected year after year and being able to see the change and see the improvement. And that's really what it's all about. It isn't, we're going to get perfect next year. It's, we're going to keep taking steps that improve things and see if it is improving things, and if it's not, do something different, right? This is the whole idea, and this is why we aren't, we don't know what the answers really are, but we know some of the directions that we need to go in. We can tell that there is a lot of work to be done. And my final comment on this, it's really beginning to become a thing. You know, you see stories in the New York Times regularly about the potential of soil for climate change. And there was just one a few days ago that talked about a new study that's come out that was sponsored by the Nature Conservancy, and its headline was "Part of the answer to climate change may be America's trees and dirt." The other thing I would also point out, we have a number of people here who are oriented towards health and human health, and the health connection is an important one. For example, all of that soil biology is very much a mirror of what goes on inside of us in our gut, and the inner microbiome is incredibly important to our health, and we're learning more about that every day. And we're learning more about how just contact with living soil improves our health. And there's so much that's done to soil in the name of, increasing production that is unhealthy, and that is really at the root of so many of the degenerative chronic diseases that we are grappling with as a society. So it's not just human health, it's community health, it's water health, it's global planetary health. So we're going to take a break. We have some great food that came from mostly local producers and people at the farmers market, and I hope you'll appreciate it. Some donated by Buffalo Mountain Co-op in Hardwick. I'm going to give a big shout out to them. And so we're going to reconvene, have some food, have some refreshments, and we will then come back and have conversations with you about what you want to do, what you can do, what we can help you, what we can help each other do to bring this understanding to the greater consciousness of our policymakers, our educators, our officials and our unofficials and everybody in between. Beth, did you have a...
Yes. I'd like to invite us all to rise and sing.
Yes.
And I will sing it first so you know what it is, and then everybody join in.
And well, just...
It's stolen from Novo.
Okay, well, I want to also recognize Lorraine, who told me when she came in here that she had a song that she wanted to share. So we have two songs. And
let's do Beth.
Let's do Beth first, but thank you.
Okay. I'll sing it, then we'll all sing it. Thank you for this food, this glorious, glorious food. And the animals, and the vegetables, and the minerals, and the microbes, and the farmers that made it possible. Ready? Thank you for this food, this glorious, glorious food. And the animals, and the vegetables, and the minerals, and the microbes, and the farmers that made it possible.
Well, I heard on the radio that something not so good is going on with the wolves out west. They're going to take them up to the Endangered Species Act because the farmers are all upset that the wolves are eating their livestock. And I'm thinking, well, maybe if the wolves had more habitat, if we had stolen it and messed up the soil. Anyway, so I thought of this song that I first sang when I was in Girl Scout camp over 50 years ago. And I'll sing that part first, and then I wrote a couple verses. And I have to look at them, because even though I wrote them, I forget them. Land of the silver birch, home of the beaver, where once the mighty wolf wandered at will. Moonlight and rocky shore, we will return once more. Hey-ya, hey-yo. Walking this planet, mother to us all, feeling the spirit strong, restoring right from wrong. Hey-ya, hey-yo. Breathing the clean air, hands in the dirt, drinking the water pure, feel healing from the hurt. Hey-yo, hey-yo, land of the silver birch, home of the beaver, where once the mighty wolf wandered and will. Moonlight and rocky shore, we will return once more. Hey-yo, hey-yo.
I also want to just add one note of gratitude to the people, the First Nations of this place. And I feel remiss because I usually start my presentations with that gratitude, that acknowledgement that there were other people here before us, and their people are still here and need to be thanked, recognized, and repaid.
And could we especially have applause for our genius of the microphone standing back there? Yeah. And for our KATV videographer. Woo-hoo.
So we're going to have a snack and we're going to come back and have a discussion, so please stick around. Well, welcome back. I hope your bellies are a little full. I've been talking the whole time. I didn't actually get to taste anything. But I'll eat later. So we started a little late and we're a little off our original schedule. So I think what we'd like to do is take this last half an hour and first just give you guys an opportunity. If you had any questions that you thought we might be able to answer, we'll let you know if we can. And then keep that kind of short. And then we'd like to be able to end with, we'd like to go around having everybody ask a question that you're so moved to ask, either from information that you learned today, or and it should be a question about, what's possible. It's not going to be answered. So there will be no answer coming from this group for your question. But we find that when we hear what people are left with, what are your questions, that leaves me feeling inspired. And I think it leaves other people feeling inspired. And it also helps us learn how to deliver messages a little better, because sometimes those questions we feel like we might have answered already. Seem about right?
Yeah, so this first 10 minutes or so is really specific questions, not the big questions, but the specific ones about, what was that slide you showed? Where can we get more resources or that kind of thing? And then we'll do, the more broader.
Yeah. And did you want to take a stack of questions first, or do you just?
Yeah. So maybe let's hear popcorn style of what are the questions in the room. So that, because otherwise, if we just start with one question, we might go ping-ponging back and forth on that one for the whole question and answer period. So let's just hear what the specific questions are from anyone who has them. And maybe, Grace, do you have a pen and paper? Or do you do?
Okay, so raise your hand if you have a question that you're hoping to get an answer to.
Yes.
If we want to have a lawn, is there a kind of grass or something that we can plant that would be more nutritious and more conducive to creating the rhizome?
Great. What else?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, what are the hot policy topics that will be coming up in the Vermont government 2019?
2019 policy. Any other questions?
How about loosening soil with a pitchfork, pros and cons?
Okay.
Do you have thought about, in terms of the community building aspect of this work, about how you're going to continue from this?
Good one.
Besides preserving open land, what else can we do to support the soil carbon sponge?
Okay.
Very specific. About a Moss of Liking doing a vegetable garden.
Okay.
What are they doing there?
What are they doing?
Do I want them?
Okay.
That might be enough for now.
Well, let's just hear them all. We may not get to all of them, so.
Okay.
Any others? Okay, great.
I didn't mean to cut anybody off from asking questions, please.
Okay, maybe we should.
Okay.
In order? The first one was about lawns.
If we want a lawn, what's the best thing to plant?
I'll take a stab at that. So anytime I'm asking myself questions about what I'm going to do in my garden or yard or in someone else's or in the schoolyard, I'm changing them. The more I learn about what the microbes are doing and how all systems are connected, I ask myself, how many of the soil health principles am I hitting with this activity that I want to do? How many was I hitting with the last way I was doing it? How many will I be hitting with the next way that I'm doing it? So in the context of a lawn, I might first go out and look at my lawn and say, well, is there a lot of bare ground in my lawn? And you can really tell after a mowing, the spaces between, is there a lot of bare ground? Is there a lot of litter on the ground? How many species are growing in my lawn? How many of those?
Litter meaning?
Litter meaning, thank you. Dead grass, leaves, sticks, not beer bottles, no, the good kind of soil organic matter litter. So dead plants, leaves that are mulched things on the soil. Some of us have mulching lawnmowers that spit it back onto the soil. So I'd be looking for those places and then asking myself, how can I increase diversity in this lawn? How can I have less bare soil? How can I minimize disturbance? How can I have animals in contact with the soil? How can I slow and sink the water is another question I ask for myself. Is water infiltrating? But so then for the short answer, I can say that there are, in most of our general stores and garden centers, you can buy something called a conservation mix, which is rye, fescue, and white clover, typically. So that's giving you 3 species, which is better than 1. And how can we move that toward 8 and 12 and 15 and 30 even? Is it okay? Do I mind having buckthorn and dandelion in my lawn? Once I understand that the dandelion root goes quite deep and can break through compaction in some situations, and it provides me food and medicine. Once I start to look at all those species and how I'm using them, what things are growing in my lawn that I can eat? What can I make medicine with? So that helps me to further diversify from that conservation mix. Did I answer that well enough, or I can't remember who asked the question?
Yes.
Good.
Beautiful. Can I throw something on to the comment?
Sure.
I'm building some area in this place in Manchester, inner city lot, by trying to build some soil there without needing anything to be mowed, because we want to keep maintenance low. And we have clover on it, and so right away it looks beautiful, it's making nitrogen, and it's feeding bees. And I sprinkled yarrow seed on it because if it gets weed whacked a couple times a year, you don't get, tall, spiky flowers, but then you get the medicinal benefit of the yarrow to the soil, and it's feathery and beautiful. Ground diving, a lot of people think it's a terrible thing, but it spreads, it's beautiful, it's low, it has a little purple flower, and it's in the mid-family, which means it works really well with soil fungi, and it does well whether
it's wet or dry, and it's just a pretty little thing, and it's hardly conspicuous unless you're looking closely. And those all, it makes a really nice mix.
Next question, what are the hot 2019 policy topics in the Vermont legislature? Yeah.
Does anyone here feel most connected?
Come on.
Well, in terms of soil, we were actually talking about this, like what, if there was a bill that was introduced, regenerative ag bill, and does everyone know what regenerative ag means, regenerative?
No. Well, in short, I can say that it's systems that help to regenerate ecosystems while we're growing.
And it's essentially agriculture that's following as many of the soil health principles as they can put into practice with the resources that they have.
Which most organic farmers do.
So there was a bill last year, I don't think it got passed out of committee. And then 350 Vermont has a no new fossil fuel infrastructure bill that will be reintroduced, which isn't ag related, but we also have a resolution that has the ag component and the no new fossil fuel infrastructure component. And so passing more resolutions will send a message to legislators that, you know, we want a solutions-based approach to climate change, and those solutions include building the soil carbon sponge, as well as, you know, getting more public transportation and not building any new fossil fuel infrastructure. So it has to be approached from all different angles. Those are the only, I don't know if Rural Vermont or another organization is going to introduce a bill, but we did talk about trying to write something up, but we're thinking more for 2020, like spending some time really studying and focusing on what the best language would be and then introducing that.
I would say that one of the hot topics that continues to be a hot topic is water quality.
Yeah.
And what we're requiring of farmers and what help farmers are getting to protect water quality. And I think that one of the missing pieces is the idea of compensating farmers for their ecosystem services and giving them incentives that way rather than another label in the marketplace to confuse consumers. So I think that, you know, to the extent that anybody's going and yakking with their legislators, and they were all invited to come here today, you might put that bug in their ear that you think that's a better idea than even a carbon tax. I support the proposal that was put forth last year that didn't get anywhere, but you know, we need something more holistic, if you will, than just focusing on carbon. And as you've all seen, you know, the preoccupation with carbon as a bad thing isn't a good thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say that a couple of things. One is that traveling the country, and particularly in the Midwest, a lot of the leading people in the regenerative agriculture movement are conservative Christians, and that this conversation, when you can focus it around land function and water, is a very, very unifying conversation. And there are lots of very liberal and very conservative people working very well together on this issue. And that's, as you were saying, you know, back a little bit away from the carbon conversation. And I often just use the term soil sponge, just a little more simply, even though I love soil carbon sponge. They're both useful, but it depends where you're speaking. So adjust your language, adjust your message. I also got to do that flour versus bread demonstration at the Vermont when they were looking at the regenerative ag bill, and the word came back to me that conversation was one of the things that helped them come together. So that's I find that's why I try to kind of simplify it and get it back to the water conversation, because people, it's much more direct. It's something we all know that we need water and clean water and flood control, et cetera. It's a place where it's hard to disagree about that, so.
I can picture this really talking in front of the legislature. I mean, that would be huge. Doesn't have to be as long as this, but you could put some nuggets, give them some nuggets that would help them think.
I'll just reiterate that the flower and bread activity is so useful. It works with 5-year-olds, with 80-years-olds, with legislators, with the UN. Legislators.
I mean, on Wall Street.
It works with everyone. It works at a dinner party. It just doesn't take too long, and you can even just talk your way through it, although having the flower and bread is really nice. And I like to make people dig into the flower to find that dry plate underneath too, so you can really get into it. So you don't have to have a scientific background to be able to make the connection between soil and water. It's one of the beautiful things about the activity that Dee Dee created there. One last thing I'll say about policy is if you're not already connected with rural Vermont, please get connected. If you're interested in learning about what's important in terms of agriculture policy, rural Vermont has really got their finger on the pulse. I'm on the board of that organization. And one of the founding members, So that would be a really good place to keep up with what happens. We're about to start a new biennium. So Vermont is a 2-year biennium. So our legislature runs for 2 years and then we switch. We have Governor Scott for 2 more years, and we know that anything that's going to require money is probably not going to go through, and all of our organizations are really limited in capacity. So in terms of healthy soils, one of the things that we're really working toward is building that social mycelium connection to find out what do land managers need and what do land managers need to be undone in terms of legislative barriers so that they can deepen the sponge. And when we can find that information out by actually speaking with people on their farms and on their land, then we'll be able to figure that out. And when I say we, that is a whole range of organizations. So that's rural Vermont, it's the NOFAs in 5 different states, and lots of other groups, including Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, that are sort of working together to gauge the temperature of what do we actually need. We have a lot of new information about how soil systems work. And some of our laws were designed before we had any idea what we were creating barriers to.
And I would like to also put in a plug for local planning commissions. Get on those local planning commissions, get that information to the local planning commissions, get them to, when the demand comes from that source, the legislature listens.
And this is a way for them, for local regions and the state to save money, I think is really key, so that when we have a conservative government there, that's a key message there, is that we can save on road repairs, on bridge repairs, on water treatment plants, on cleanup. So.
Yes.
Well, you guys are going to talk about questions that don't get an answer. And my question is, it's not just about what you do, it's about how much of it you do, right? The scale of the emergency that we're in doesn't just require very efficient action, but at a sort of unimaginable scale. So, Vermonters really love to identify as Vermonters, and we think of ourselves in this Vermont neighborhood of 500,000 people or so. The neighborhood I lived in Brooklyn competed with that population. And so we can do a lot of things here in Vermont that in the longer term are not going to really impact our long-term future, right? And so how do we scale up our implementation of these amazing models? We're onto something here. The Healthy Soils Coalition is onto something. agriculture is going to collapse for huge portions of the world, and it's going to get worse and worse until we can sequester a bunch of carbon and other greenhouse gases. If we can produce food and sequester greenhouse gases at the same time, we're really onto something. 350 and others are promoting this whole drawdown analysis of what the most effective ways to mitigate climate change are. And in Vermont, really the agricultural land use pieces are the only ones we really have access to. So the question is, how do we act as though we are in the emergency that we really are in, and dedicate that much time and energy to really start talking to our neighbors and friends and getting people to act like we're in an emergency, right? Act like there's going to be a huge amount of pain and suffering that we know is coming if we don't act with a great amount of consistency and diligence and vivaciousness and et cetera. So that's my big question. Yeah. Thanks.
Janet?
Is there a way to utilize mass media? Do you remember the ice bucket challenge and how it took off? Well, I was just thinking about that this morning, and how could that be applied in some way to that flour and bread demonstration so people really get the picture? Like John can make videos. So Dee, if you wanted to come to our house and do that, we'd make a video, right? And then present it as a challenge. Like, do you really want to feel like a real Vermonter? Well, here's what it will take, take this challenge. Something like that.
Yeah, we should get back to our list of questions, but just an answer to that was the Kiss the Ground, which makes wonderful videos, has offered to do one, but I'd love to do one before then, because, and there is one online right now that's pretty decent.
We need to do all of the above.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of other very specific questions I think we should try to work in the answers to. One is about soil tillage with a pitchfork. Somebody, Bradley. And moss and lichen in the garden. And I think that I'll start out with a couple of answers. Clearly, disturbing the soil as little as possible is a good thing, but if you're going to disturb the soil, some kind of garden fork is the best way. It is not going to turn over the soil, like the old aphorism about the Native American coming and seeing the newly plowed sodbusters field and looks at it and goes, wrong way up. It's a terrible thing to do, but it sometimes is necessary on large operations and for various reasons. But on a garden scale, that's my tool of choice in my garden at this point. But I still have cut back on how much I use that. Moss and lichen is generally a sign of acidity and lack of light also. So you're not getting enough sunlight. And you're also, it's acid and it's probably not very well drained. Too much moisture. So, there are various things to do about that, but it's probably not the best thing to see in your vegetable garden. Anybody else want to?
I would just chime in that, I love moss and lichen, but it's not necessarily what I want growing where I'm trying to grow tomatoes or something. And I find that when I have mosses growing on my ground, it's an indicator of compaction, which also tends to blend toward acidity and not enough drainage. And so the fork could be a good partnership there to try and get some air, but the fork is only going to bring air in for a minute. The biology is going to bring in air for a long time. So then using compost or just layering on lasagna, letting the biological activity come to play, compost can be a wonderful inoculum to sort of jumpstart some of those species into their, and to mix up the diversity to get it back to billions. So I think that, yeah, the fork and the moss will work well together.
That's really helpful because it's on the top of some raised beds which get sun all day long. So that seems like drainage and sun, but it must be compaction.
I would say one thing about that, which is that lichen is how this all got started. So love your lichen, but it's the beginning of soil formation. Okay, it's when the fungi in the ocean needed to get onto land, but they needed an energy source, and so they partnered up with algae and became this thing that could travel over, because there was not enough. There was so much life in the ocean and not on land, and all the minerals grew on land. So they climbed up to start breaking down minerals. So it's your soil and it's your whole biome doing exactly what it needs to start making soil. But you can help it along.
I don't want to have to wait.
So it took, how many millions or billions of years till we got here yet? You might want to speed it up.
Okay. And the other questions are, I would say, are the bigger questions. One is about how do we continue the conversation, and I think that that's something that I would personally like to see happen around here in various ways. The other is, how do we support the soil carbon sponge? And I think continuing the conversation is one big way of doing that. But let's hear some more ideas of big questions.
Can I just speak to the one about continuing the conversation? The free facilitators manual, one of the reasons I wrote that is because it's something that anyone could take and lead people through. And it has the flower and bread demo, has several other things. You could pick and choose, you don't have to do all of them. But it's a easy to use way of meeting with a group of people over several weeks and going through this set of exercises together. So that's something that I just offer to you, that if anyone wanted to bring together a small group in this area to go through that, that's a free resource.
And I use that manual and I'm adapting it for elementary and middle school to connect school composting systems to soil science and math. And Dee Dee's manual is an incredible template to work with. So I'm just adapting it where I need to work with these kids, but you can adapt it for anything. It's really well written and it's really easy to follow. There's some really fun activities.
I want to just put a little permaculture twist on some of this. One of the principles of permaculture that is coming home to me a lot is that every problem is an opportunity. You just have to look at it the right way. And I see, for changing some minds out in our big farm country, there's this huge crisis and just an opportunity. People who voted for the current administration are getting kicked in these ankles or higher spots, whatever. They're losing their markets. It would be surprising if they don't get the kind of farm bill they're used to having. And so their way of farming is coming under attack from directions they need. And that's an opportunity to say, maybe you should have an export besides corn and soybeans. Maybe there's something you can do here to have your income be more resilient because you're not losing your soil or, all these other things, because they are having some real existential crises there. We voted for this administration and now it's wrecking us. And I see that as a way in to change.
So shall we do a go-around with questions that we're not going to answer, but you keep the conversation going? And I think asking questions that aren't going to get answered when a presentation is happening is actually a way to build a community. because it's like everybody's thinking about these on their way out the door and start talking. So.
I'd like to just add one more thing to the last two sort of big questions. How do we keep it going? Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition listserv is one way to stay in touch with the conversation. And the Soil Carbon Coalition leads a series of trainings called Land Listener Workshops or Soil Monitoring Workshops, which use the manual that Dee Dee's written. Essentially, we're doing a lot of that work and some of the work done on the Soil Carbon Coalition site. And so those are really wonderful ways to deepen your knowledge. We offer half-day, full-day, and 3-day trainings. Prefer to do just 3-day trainings, but it often takes people a little bit to understand why you might want to take 3 days. And then once you do, you do. So you can look out for those sorts of things too. And if you've signed up for our list, that's how you'll find out about those things.
And we've also been having regular seminars, several days long at the which I was privileged to go to the last 2 years of, and got my mind blown. After having studied soils for 40 years, I got a whole new perspective on what's happening, what people are doing in Australia and internationally, and you can spare the time at that time of year. It generally happens in May.
Whenever Walter.
And there are also videos online that feature the people who've been speaking at these seminars, some extensive coverage of the seminars themselves. So that's one way to educate yourself even more about it.
Another thing is that if you have a big conventional dairy farmer in their community, like, I don't know, just try and engage in conversation about these topics, or have, dinner parties with friends that may not think about this stuff around this topic. I'm always thinking about how to get the non-choir involved in the movement. But food is a really good way to do that. Everyone likes to eat, or needs to eat. So, having some sort of, getting an event with free food or something will draw a lot of people in, and then you can talk about these topics.
Annie, over in the corner, do you want to start us with the big questions?
I don't know what
Okay. Totally fine to pass, or you pass them as well. Okay, let's just come back this way. Go ahead.
Me?
Would you like to go? Yes, we need someone to start.
What is it? What is it here?
Unanswerable question.
Unanswerable.
Yeah, let's have some currently on it.
Oh, I'm really interested in the fact that we're also interested in this. And we come up with different energies, Henry was talking about, how do we get to be like emergency every time we get going, which is impossible. But, and then how do we really develop love for each other and our appreciation of this earth that we're on, and I don't know. I mean, it's exciting, and I don't want to walk out and go into my apartment and not feel the connection that is, that is voiced here and feels that's my interest. I think that's enough.
Thank you. Beth?
I will gladly accept answers and direct directions and support in my big question, which is how do we bring to our teenagers in their schools the knowledge that was nicely summarized in one of these slides by, never mind how many screens you have, if we don't have that rich soil and rain, we're over. In other words, let's do it. Whatever mountains we have to move to get there.
I'm thinking about our sewage disposal systems, which are now antiquated, and everybody says there's no money to redo them. So how can this knowledge of the soil sponge and everything help with that? It's clear to see how it can help clean up legislative claims, but it's all together. The rivers can never solve.
Composting toilets.
In St. Johnsbury, in apartment houses? Sure.
No answers.
How can we use social media, which is the way of connecting with the youth, in a way that will generate responses and support for this movement?
My question is related to the fact that because I think capitalism is collapsing, that one of the symptoms of that, or that our civilization is collapsing because of capitalism, one of the symptoms is that everybody is having to do 5 times as much stuff to just make a living, and so people don't feel like they have any time to take something on. So in that context, how do we slow down the conversation, make the relationships that need to happen, write the articles, do that? And I see especially that franticness in the school system when I worked in the school system. And anyway, so I'm always trying to think about how do we slow things down when that's also present.
I have to think a little longer.
You can come back.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask about maybe how do you get kids off their screens, but somebody already did that. I'd like to find a way to promote the outdoors as therapy for mental illness or just depression or just social isolation, because if we don't have a culture of people wanting to work the land, and I think we need people on the land to fix these issues and a way to get people to care about it. We may have to go, kind of a circuitous route to get people with mental issues out doing the things that make them feel more stable. That may be one entry point. I'd like to see that work on.
Yeah, they're doing that with vets, PTSD, and it's working really well.
It's going to connect a bunch of questions, starting with vets about how to get youth. We're looking for social connection and viable careers that don't make you work into the ground, no pun intended. How do we connect the wisdom that we already have to the youthful energy and need to do something regenerative and positive and not just make money? Because we've got a lot of people who want to work, but we want to work on our things.
How do we encourage, exhort, remind, get our neighbors to consume less?
How do we shift our thinking from just about information and knowledge to a shift in consciousness? That we really do need to shift away from the way that we naturally and normally have come to think of as normal, to actually shift from a new perspective of consciousness.
So my mentor and I would talk about a lot about life force in our food and how that's declining. And then actually Rodell Institute did a study that showed that vegetables don't have as much nutrients as they did 50 years ago. And a lot of that has to do with the soil microbial life. And, but I'm concerned that people eating this kind of dead food is causing more illness and kind of just a sleepiness in their minds. And so I guess how can we convince farmers that they need to grow healthy, nutritious food and that that's their role? I find it unconscionable that farmers grow food that's poisoning their communities. And so how do we make that transition and help educate farmers about their role as leaders and doctors?
I don't know, camera person, would you like to, Mike, do you want to say anything?
What am I going to do about my mom? And what are we going to do about all the parking lots in the world?
How do we take advantage of this window of opportunity where so many people in the last recent number of years have been impacted by catastrophic weather events? People who either weren't interested or denied climate change. I think there's a receptivity now, and to gather those folks in and make them part of this whole movement.
It's a short question, but how do we help each other know that we are each other's best natural resource? And the other question is, I just have this idea of my family's going to have a family reunion later next year, and how do I take, this is going to be the holiday entertainment, the bread and the flour, but by next summer when we have a reunion of I don't know how many people, but all different ages, like how can I make this a really interesting party game?
Well, kind of like that, Marilyn. I guess what I keep saying to myself is, what concrete personal actions can I take to keep the spirit of this afternoon alive?
You're up. I have two questions. One of them, I was interested in one of you folks were talking about, I thought, the diminishing of our aquifers, and I was kind of interested in hearing more about that, because that's a major concern to all of us, because as they disappear, all of this talk about the soil health and everything kind of goes out the window. The other thought that I had, because we've talked about this a lot with the community garden, is bringing food and nutritious food more into the mainstream and into the schools for young people, and how all of what we were talking about today, how all of that can contribute to a much greater social problem of poverty in our society, and how what we are trying to do with improving the soil and producing nutritious food can address that big issue in our society. That's a mouthful, but I mean, and maybe it's beyond the scope of what you we're talking about here, but it's not really. It's very much connected to that social problem that we have.
Well,
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation.
thank you for coming. And I would follow that with more of the social issue dimension. And in my particular quest right now is to find a way to share the land. And those of us who have access to land many of us are my age and older, don't have children who want to take it over, perhaps. And there are people out there who would love to have an opportunity to use it and to use it well in these ways that we've been talking about today. So how do we make those connections? And I'm particularly thinking about the African American and people of color communities who are really beginning to rise as leaders in alternative agriculture, and who really don't have the resources to buy land, but at the same time, I think that it would be a great way to fix Vermont's whiteness problem. So that's my big question.
How do we encourage everybody to invest in our future? Really invest in an equitable future for all beings on this planet.
I know it's kind of unruly earlier, and that's a big question then, but on sort of the same tack, I think the question is, what's the mass movement cooperative, agricultural cooperative opportunity? In 1889, the populist movement started in the middle of nowhere in Texas with 2 farmers. And by 1892, they had 40,000 trained lecturers going all over the country and millions of farmers in wagon trains from Oregon to DC advocating against the bankers, basically. We have the crisis, we've got the ideas. What is that economic opportunity, and how do we get people to actually invest in that opportunity and declare for each other and create that united economic foundation that we can work with?
Public banks, composting toilets.
I'm sorry, I can't help answering public banks. Annie, you have got something.
I can make a question that's really more of a suggestion. The idea of keeping this going on a neighborhood level, walking distance neighbors or a short drive, I find incredibly empowering and powerful. So how can we get as many of these groups going? We can sit around and, I've had one group that's been going for 9 years, we do handwork. I've got another group that just started, we're actually talking about climate change and adaptations. And everyone's excited, we have fun. It is very empowering. So how do we get more people to respond? Easy to just do it.
I just want to appreciate all 3 of you for the information and the very receptive way that you pass it on to us, and just let you know I'm very proud of you as 3 very strong women.